welcome to Story Rhyme with Brendan, where I read a story or a poem for you. This time I'll read the first 3 chapters of a book called A Complete Account of the Settlement at Port Jackson by Watkin Tench. This book is about the founding years of the Port Jackson settlement. Well, let's begin. To Sir Watkin Williams Wynne Bart. Sir, a life passed on service in distant and obscure countries has hitherto prevented me from aspiring to a personal acquaintance with you. I know you only from the representations of others, not having seen you for the last 14 years. Consequently, I can judge but imperfectly whether transactions of a remote and unknown colony will prove sufficiently attractive to engage your attention. Gratitude to a family from whom I have received the deepest obligations nevertheless impels me to beg your acceptance of this tribute. Descended of illustrious ancestors and born to a splendid patrimony, the career of manhood opens before you. May your progression in that career accomplish the hopes which sanguine expectation has formed of your character. Your honourable and revered father presents the fairest example, that like him you may shine incorrupt and independent in the Senate, and in private life practice beneficence without ostentation and adorn hospitality with elegance, is the earnest and sincere wish of him who has the honour to be, Sir, your most devoted and most obedient humble servant, Watkin Tench. Preface. When it is recollected how much has been written to describe the settlement of New South Wales, it seems necessary, if not to offer an apology, yet to assign a reason for an additional publication. The author embarked in the fleet which sailed to found the establishment of Botany Bay. He shortly after published a narrative of the proceedings and state of the colony, brought up to the beginning of July 1788, which was well received and passed through 3 editions. This could not but inspire both confidence and gratitude, but gratitude would be badly manifested were he on the presumption of former favour to lay claim to present indulgence. He resumes the subject in the humble hope of communicating information and increasing knowledge of the country which he describes. He resided at Port Jackson nearly 4 years, from the 20th of January 1788 until the 18th of December 1791. To an active and contemplative mind, a new country in an inexhaustible source of curiosity and speculation. It was the author's custom not only to note daily occurrences and to inspect and record the progression of improvement, but also, when not prevented by military duties, to penetrate the surrounding country in different directions in order to examine its nature and ascertain its relative geographical situations. The greatest part of the work is inevitably composed of those materials which a journal supplies, but wherever reflections could be introduced without fastidiousness and parade, he has not scrupled to indulge them, in common with every other deviation which the strictness of narrative would allow. When this publication was nearly ready for the press, and when many of the opinions which it records had been declared, fresh accounts from Port Jackson were received. To the state of a country where so many anxious, trying hours of his life have passed, the author cannot feel indifferent, if by any sudden revolution of the laws of nature, or by any fortunate discovery of those on the spot, it has really become that fertile and prosperous land which some represent it to be. He begs permission to add his voice to the general congratulation. He rejoices at its success, but it is only justice to himself and those with whom he acted to declare that they feel no cause of reproach that so complete and happy an alteration did not take place at an earlier period. Contents: Chapters 1 through 12, Chapter 13 to 19. List of subscribers. Several pages worth. All in alphabetical order. A complete account. Chapter 1. A retrospect of the state of the colony of Port Jackson on the date of my former narrative in July 1788. Previous to commencing any farther account of the subject which I am about to treat, such a retrospection of the circumstances and situation of the settlement at the conclusion of my former narrative as shall lay its state before the reader seems necessary in order to connect the present with the past. The departure of the first fleet of ships for Europe on the 14th of July 1788 had been long impatiently expected, and had filled us with anxiety to communicate to our friends an account of our situation, describing the progress of improvement and the probability of success or failure in our enterprise. That men should judge very oppositely on so doubtful and precarious an event will hardly surprise. 1788. Such relations could contain little besides the sanguineness of hope and the enumeration of hardships and difficulties which former accounts had not led us to expect. Since our disembarkation in the preceding January, the efforts of every one had been unremittingly exerted to deposit the public stores in a state of shelter and security, and to erect habitations for ourselves. We were eager to escape from tents, where a fold of canvas only interposed to check the vertic beams of the sun in summer and the chilling blasts of the south in winter. A marquee pitched in our finest season on an English lawn, or a transient view of those gay camps near the metropolis, which so many remember, naturally draws forth careless and unmeaning exclamations of rapture, which attach ideas of pleasure only to this of a soldier's life. But an encampment amidst the rocks and wilds of the new country, aggravated by the miseries of bad diet and incessant toil, will find few admirers. 1788. Nor were our exertions less unsuccessful than they were laborious. Under wretched covers of thatch lay our provisions and stores, exposed to destruction from every flash of lightning and every spark of fire. A few of the convicts had got into huts, but almost all the officers and the whole of the soldiery were still in tents. In such a situation, where knowledge of the mechanic arts afforded the sunrest recommendation to notice, it may be easily conceived that attention to the parade duty of the troops gradually diminished. Now were to be seen officers and soldiers not trailing the puissant pike, but felling the ponderous gum tree or breaking the stubborn clod. And though the broad falchion did not in the ploughshare end, the possession of a spade, a wheelbarrow, or a dunghill was more coveted than the most refulgent arms in which heroism ever dazzled. Those hours, which in other countries are devoted to martial acquirements, were here consumed in the labours of the saw-pit, the forge, and the quarry. Side-note: the Swedish prisoners taken at the Battle of Pultowa were transported by the Tsar Peter to the most remote parts of Siberia, with a view to civilize the natives of the country, and teach them the arts the Swedes possessed. In this hopeless situation, all traces of discipline and subordination between the different ranks were quickly obliterated. The soldiers, who were husbandmen and artificers, found out their superiority and assumed it. The officers became the servants. Voltaire. Of the two ships of war, the Sirius in supply, the latter was incessantly employed in transporting troops, convicts, and stores to Norfolk Island, and the Sirius in preparing for a voyage to some port where provisions for our use might be purchased, an expected supply from England not having arrived. It is but justice to the officers and men of both these ships to add that, on all occasions, they were fully shared every hardship and fatigue with those on shore. 1788. On the convicts the burden fell yet heavier. Necessity compelled us to allot to them the most slavish and laborious employments, those operations which in other countries are preferred by the brute creation, were here effected by the exertions of men, but this ought not to be considered a grievance, because they had always been taught to expect it, as the inevitable consequence of their offences against society. Severity was rarely exercised on them, and justice was administered without partiality or discrimination. Their rations of provisions, except in being debarred from an allowance of spirits, was equal to that which the marines received. Under these circumstances, I record with pleasure that they behaved better than had been predicted of them. To have expected sudden and complete reformation of conduct were romantic and chimerical. Our cultivation of the land was yet in its infancy. We had hitherto tried only the country contiguous to Sydney. Here the governor had established a government farm, at the head of which a competent person of his own household was placed, with convicts to work under him. Almost the whole of the officers likewise accepted of small tracts of ground for the purpose of raising grain and vegetables, but experience proved to us that the soil would produce neither without manure, and as this was not to be procured, our vigour soon slackened, and most of the farms, among which was the one belonging to government, was successfully abandoned. 1788. With the natives we were very little more acquainted than on our arrival in the country. Our intercourse with them was neither frequent or cordial. They seemed studiously to avoid us, either from fear, jealousy, or hatred. When they met with unarmed stragglers, they sometimes killed and sometimes wounded them. I confess that in common with many others, I was inclined to attribute this conduct to a spirit of malignant levity, but a farther acquaintance with them, founded on several instances of their humanity and generosity, which shall be noticed in their proper places, has entirely reversed my opinion, and led me to conclude that the unprovoked outrages committed upon them by unprincipled individuals among us caused the evils we had experienced. To prevent them from being plundered of their fishing tackle and weapons of war, a proclamation was issued, forbidding their sale among us, but it was not attended with the good effect which was hoped for from it. During this period, notwithstanding the want of fresh provisions and vegetables, and almost constant exposure to the vicissitudes of the variable climate, disease rarely attacked us, and the number of deaths was too inconsiderable to deserve mention. Norfolk Island had been taken possession of by the party detached for that purpose, early after our arrival. Few accounts of it had yet reached us, and here I beg leave to observe that as I can speak of this island only from the relations of others, never having myself been there, I shall in every part of this work mention it sparingly as possible, and this more especially as it seems probable that some of those gentlemen, who from accurate knowledge and long residence on it are qualified to write its history, will oblige the world with such a publication. Chapter 2. Transactions of the colony from the sailing of the First Fleet in July 1788 to the close of that year. It was impossible to behold without emotion the departure of the ships. On their speedy arrival in England perhaps hinged our fate, by hastening our supplies to us. On the 20th of July, the supply sailed for Norfolk Island and returned to us on the 26th of August, bringing no material news except that the soil was found to suit grain and other seeds, which had been sown in it, and that a species of flax plant was discovered to grow spontaneously on the island. 1788. A survey of the harbour of Port Jackson was now undertaken, in order to compute the number of canoes and inhabitants which it might contain. 67 canoes and 147 people were counted. No estimate, however, of even tolerable accuracy can be drawn from so imperfect a datum, though it was perhaps the best in our power to acquire. In July and August, we experienced more inclement, tempestuous weather than had been observed at any former period of equal duration, and yet it deserves to be remarked, in honour of the climate, that although our number of people exceeded 900, not a single death happened in the latter month. The dread of want in a country destitute of natural resource is ever peculiarly terrible. We had long turned our eyes with impatience towards the sea, cheered by the hope of seeing supplies from England approach, but none arriving on the 2nd of October. The Sirius sailed for the Cape of Good Hope, with directions to purchase provisions there for the use of our garrison. A new settlement, named by the Governor Rose Hill, 16 miles inland, was established on the 3rd of November. The soil here being judged better than that around Sydney, a small redoubt was thrown up, and the captain's detachment was posted in it to protect the convicts who were employed to cultivate the ground. The two last of the transports left us for England on the 19th of November, intending to make their passage by Cape Horn. There now remained with us only the Supply. Sequestered and cut off as we were from the rest of civilized nature, their absence carried the effect of desolation. About this time, a convict of the name of Daly was hanged for a burglary. This culprit, who was a notorious thief and impostor, was the author of a discovery of a gold mine a few months before, a composition resembling or mingled with earth, which he pretended to have brought from it, he produced. After a number of attendant circumstances, too ludicrous and contemptible to relate, which befell a party who was sent under his guidance to explore this second Peru, he at last confessed that he had broken up an old pair of buckles and mixed the pieces with sand and stone, and on essaying the composition, the brass was detected. The fate of this fellow I should not deem worth recording, did it not lead to the following observation: that the utmost circumspection is necessary to prevent imposition in those who give accounts of what they see in unknown countries. We found the convicts particularly happy in fertility of invention and exaggerated descriptions. Hence large freshwater rivers, valuable ores, and quarries of limestone, chalk, and marble were daily proclaimed soon after we had landed. At first we hearkened with avidity to such accounts, but perpetual disappointments taught us to listen with caution and to believe from demonstration only. Unabated animosity continued to prevail between the natives and us. In addition to former losses, a soldier and several convicts suddenly disappeared, and were never afterwards heard of. 3 convicts were also wounded, and 1 killed by them near Botany Bay, similar to the vindictive spirit which Mr. Cook found to exist among their countrymen at Endeavour River. They more than once attempted to set fire to combustible matter in order to annoy us. Early on the morning of the 18th of December, word was brought that they were assembled in force near the brick kilns, which stand but a mile from the town of Sydney. The terror of those who brought the first intelligence magnified the number to 2,000. A second messenger diminished it to 400. A detachment under the command of an officer was ordered to march immediately and reconnoitre them. The officer soon returned and reported that about 50 Indians had appeared at the brick kilns, but upon the convicts who were at work there, pointing their spades and shovels at them in the manner of guns, they had fled into the woods. Tired of this state of petty warfare and endless uncertainty, the governor at length determined to adopt a decisive measure by capturing some of them and retaining them by force, which we supposed would either inflame the rest to signal vengeance, in which case we should know the worst and provide accordingly, or else it would induce an intercourse by the report which our prisoners would make of the mildness and indulgence with which we used them. And farther, it promised to unveil the cause of their mysterious conduct, by putting us in possession of the reasons for harassing and destroying our people in the manner I have related. Boats were accordingly ordered to be got ready, and every preparation made which could lead to the attainment of our object. But as this subject deserves to be particularly detailed, I shall, notwithstanding its being just within the period of time which this chapter professes to comprise, allot it at a separate place in the beginning of the next. Nor can I close this part of my work without congratulating both the reader and the author. New matter now presents itself. A considerable part of the foregoing chapters had been related before, either by others or myself. I was, however, unavoidably compelled to insert it in order to preserve unbroken that chain of detail and perspicuity of arrangement at which books professing to convey information should especially aim. Chapter 3. Transactions of the Colony from the commencement of the year 1789 until the end of March. Pursuant to his resolution, the Governor on the 31st of December sent 2 boats under the command of Lieutenant Ball of the Supply and Lieutenant George Johnston of the Marines down the harbour, with directions to those officers to seize and carry off some of the natives. The boats proceeded to Manly Cove, where several Indians were seen standing on the beach, who were enticed by courteous behaviour and a few presents to enter into conversation. A proper opportunity being presented, our people rushed in among them and seized 2 men. The rest fled, but the cries of the captives soon brought them back, with many others, to their rescue, and so desperate were their struggles that in spite of every effort on our side, only one of them was secured. The other effected his escape. The boats put off without delay, and an attack from the shore instantly commenced. They threw spears, stones, firebrands, and whatever else presented itself at the boats. Nor did they retreat, agreeable to their former custom, until many muskets were fired over them. The prisoner was now fastened by ropes to the thwarts of the boat, and when he saw himself irretrievably disparted from his countrymen, set up the most piercing and lamentable cries of distress. His grief, however, soon diminished. He accepted an eat of some broiled fish, which was given to him, and sullenly submitted to his destiny. 1789. When the news of his arrival at Sydney was announced, I went with every other person to see him. He appeared to be about 30 years old, not tall, but robustly made, and of the countenance which, under happier circumstances, I thought would display manliness and sensibility. His agitation was excessive, and the clamorous crowds who flocked around him did not contribute to lessen it. Curiosity and observation seemed, nevertheless, not to have wholly deserted him. He showed the effect of novelty upon ignorance. He wondered at all he saw. Though broken and interrupted with dismay, his voice was soft and musical, when its natural tone could be heard, and he readily pronounced with tolerable accuracy the names of things which were taught him. To our ladies he quickly became extraordinarily courteous, and a sure sign that his terror was wearing off. Every blandishment was used to soothe him, and it had its effect. As he was entering the governor's house, someone touched a small bell which hung over the door. He started with horror and astonishment, but in a moment after was reconciled to the noise, and laughed at the cause of his perturbation. When pictures were shown to him, he knew directly those which represented the human figure. Among others, a very large handsome print of Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Cumberland being produced, he called out "Woman," a name by which we had just before taught him to call the female convicts. Plates of birds and beasts were also laid before him, and many people were led to believe that such as he spoke about and pointed to were known to him. But this must have been an erroneous conjecture, for the elephant, rhinoceros, and several others, which we must have discovered did they exist in the country, were of the number. Again, on the other hand, those he did not point out were equally unknown to him. 1789. His curiosity being sated, we took him to a large brick house, which was building for the governor's residence. Being about to enter, he cast up his eyes, and seeing some people leaning out of a window on the first story, he exclaimed aloud, and terrified the most extravagant surprise. Nothing here was observed to fix his attention so strongly as some tame fowls who were feeding near him. Our dogs also he particularly noticed, but seemed more fearful than fond of them. He dined at the side table at the governor's, and ate heartily of fish and ducks, which he first cooled. Bread and salt meat he smelled at, but would not taste. All our liquors he treated in the same manner, and could drink nothing but water. On being shown that he was not to wipe his hands on the chair which he sat upon, he used a towel which was gave to him with great cleanliness and decency. In the afternoon his hair was closely cut, his head combed, and his beard shaved, but he would not submit to these operations until he had seen them performed on another person, when he readily acquiesced. His hair, as might be supposed, was filled with vermin, whose destruction seemed to afford him great triumph. Nay, either revenge or pleasure prompted him to eat them, but on our expression disgust and abhorrence he left it off. To this succeeded his immersion in a tub of water and soap, where he was completely washed and scrubbed from head to foot, after which a shirt, a jacket, and a pair of trousers were put upon him. Some part of this ablation I had the honour to perform, in order that I might ascertain the real colour of the skin of these people. My observation then was, and it has since been confirmed in 1,000 other instances, that they are as black as the lighter caste of the African Negroes. Many unsuccessful attempts were made to learn his name. The governor therefore called him Manly, from the cove in which he was captured. This cove had received its name from the manly, undaunted behaviour of a party of natives seen there on our taking possession of the country. To prevent his escape, a handcuff with a rope attached to it was fastened around his left wrist, which at first highly delighted him. He called it bendegee, or ornament, but his delight changed to rage and hatred when he discovered its use. His supper he cooked himself. Some fish were given to him for this purpose, which, without any previous preparation whatever, he threw carelessly on the fire, and when they became warm took them up, and first rubbed off the scales, peeled the outside with his teeth, and ate it. Afterwards he gutted them, and laying them again on the fire, completed the dressing and ate them. A convict was selected to sleep with him, and to attend him wherever he might go. When he went with his keeper into his apartment, he appeared very restless and uneasy while the light was kept in, but on its extinction he immediately lay down and composed himself. Sullenness and dejection strongly marked his countenance on the following morning. To amuse him he was taken around the camp, and to the observatory, casting his eyes to the opposite shore from the point where he stood, and seeing the smoke of the fire lighted by his countrymen, he looked earnestly at it, and sighing deeply 2 or 3 times, uttered the word Gweenhun, fire. His loss of spirits had not, however, the effect of impairing his appetite. 8 fish, each weighing about 1 pound, constituted his breakfast, which he dressed as before. When he had finished his repast, he turned his back to the fire in a musing posture, and crept so close to it that his shirt was caught by the flame. Luckily, his keeper soon extinguished it, but he was so terrified at the accident that he was with difficulty persuaded to put on a second. 1st of January 1789. Today being New Year's Day, most of the officers were invited to the governor's table. Manly dined heartily on fish and roasted pork. He was seated on a chest near a window, out of which, when he had done eating, he would have thrown his plate, had he not been prevented. During dinner time, a band of music played in an adjoining apartment, and after the cloth was removed, one of the company sang in a very soft and superior style. But the powers of melody were lost on Manly, which disappointed our expectations, as he had before shown pleasure and readiness in imitating our tunes. Stretched out on his chest and putting his hat under his head, he fell asleep. To convince his countrymen that he had received no injury from us, the governor took him in a boat down the harbour, that they might see and converse with him. When the boat arrived and lay at a little distance from the beach, several Indians who had retired at her approached. On seeing Manly returned, he was greatly affected and shed tears. At length they began to converse. Our ignorance of the language prevented us from knowing much of what passed. It was, however, easily understood that his friends asked him why he did not jump overboard and rejoin them. He only sighed and pointed to the fetter on his leg, by which he was bound. In going down the harbour, he had described the names by which they distinguished its numerous creeks and headlands. He was now often heard to repeat that of Wirrong, Sydney, which was doubtless to inform his countrymen of the place of his captivity, and perhaps to invite them to rescue him. But this time his gloom was chased away, and he parted from his friends without testifying reluctance. His vivacity and good humour continued all the evening, and produced so good an effect on his appetite, that he ate for supper 2 kangaroo rats, each of the size of a moderate rabbit, and in addition not less than 3 pounds of fish. 2 days after he was taken on a similar excursion, but to our surprise the natives kept aloof, and would neither approach the shore or discourse with their countrymen. We could get no explanation of this difficulty, which seemed to affect us more than it did him. Uncourteous as they were, he performed to them an act of attentive benevolence, seeing a basket made of bark used by them to carry water. He conveyed into it 2 hawks and another bird, which the people in the boat had shot, and carefully covering them over, left them as a present to his old friends. But indeed, the gentleness and humanity of his disposition frequently displayed themselves. When our children, stimulated by wanton curiosity, used to flock around him, he never failed to fondle them, and if he were eating at the time, constantly offered them the choicest part of his fare. February 1789. His reserve, from want of confidence in us, continued gradually to wear away. He told us his name, and Manly gave place to Arabanu. Bread he began to relish, and tea he drank with avidity. Strong liquors he would never taste, turning from them with disgust and abhorrence. Our cats and dogs had ceased to be objects of fear, and were become his greatest pets, and constant companions at table. One of our chief amusements, after the cloth was removed, was to make him repeat the names of things in his language, which he never hesitated to do with the utmost alacrity, correcting our pronunciation when erroneous. Much information relating to the customs and manners of his country was also gained from him, but as this subject will be separately and aptly treated, I shall not anticipate myself by partially touching on it here. On the 2nd of February died Captain John Shea of the Marines, after a lingering illness. He was interred on the following day with the customary military honours amidst the regret of all who knew him. In consequence of his decease, appointments for the promotion of the oldest officer of each subordinate rank were signed by the Major Commandant of the Marine Battalion, until the pleasure of the Lords of the Admiralty should be notified. These appointments were confirmed by the Admiralty. On the 17th of February, the Supply again sailed for Norfolk Island. The Governor went down the harbour in her and carried Arabanu with him, who was observed to go on board with distrust and reluctance. When he found she was under sail, every effort was tried, without success, to exhilarate him. At length, an opportunity being presented, he plunged overboard and struck out for the nearest shore, believing that those who were left behind would fire at him. He attempted to dive, at which he was known to be very expert, but this was attended with a difficulty which he had not foreseen. His clothes proved so buoyant that he was unable to get more than his head under water. A boat was immediately dispatched after him and picked him up, though not without struggles and resistance on his side. When brought on board, he appeared neither afraid or ashamed of what he had done, but sat apart, melancholy and dispirited, and continued so until he saw the Governor and his other friends descend into a boat, and heard himself called upon to accompany them. He sprang forward, and his cheerfulness and alacrity of temper immediately returned, and lasted during the remainder of the day. The dread of being carried away on an element of whose boundary he could form no conception, joined to the uncertainty of our intention towards him, unquestionably caused him to act as he did. One of the principal effects which we had supposed the seizure and captivity of Arabanu would produce seemed yet as great a distance as ever. The natives neither manifested signs of increased hostility on his account, or attempted to ask any explanation of our conduct through the medium of their countryman, who was in our possession, and who they knew was treated with no farther harshness than in being detained among us. Their forbearance of open and determined attack upon us can be accounted for only by recollecting their knowledge of our numbers, and their dread of our firearms. That they wanted no sufficient provocation to do so will appear from what I am about to relate. March 1789. 16 convicts left their work at the brick kilns without leave and marched to Botany Bay with a design to attack the natives and to plunder them of their fishing tackle and spears. They had armed themselves with their working tools and large clubs. When they arrived near the bay, a body of Indians, who had probably seen them set out and had penetrated their intention from experience, suddenly fell upon them. Our heroes were immediately routed, and separately endeavoured to effect their escape by any means which were left. In their flight, one was killed, and 7 were wounded, for the most part very severely. Those who had the good fortune to outstrip their comrades and arrive in camp first gave the alarm, and a detachment of marines under an officer was ordered to march to their relief. The officer arrived too late to repel the Indians, but he brought in the body of a man that was killed and put an end to the pursuit. The Governor was justly incensed at what had happened, and instituted the most rigorous scrutiny into the cause which had produced it. At first the convicts were unanimous in affirming that they were quietly picking sweet tea. A side note: a vegetable creeper found growing on the rocks, which yields an infusion in hot water, a sweet astringent taste, whence it derives its name. To its virtues, the healthy state of the soldiery and convicts may be greatly attributed. It was drunk universally. When they were, without provocation, assaulted by the natives, with whom they had no wish to quarrel, some of them, however, more irresolute than the rest, had last disclosed the purpose for which the expedition had been undertaken, and the whole were ordered to be severely flogged. Arabanu was present at the infliction of the punishment, and was made to comprehend the cause and the necessity of it, but he displayed on the occasion symptoms of disgust and terror only. March 1789. On the 24th instant, the supply arrived from Norfolk Island and Lord Howe Island, bringing from the latter place 3 turtles. An awful and terrible example of justice took place towards the close of this month, which I record with regret, but which it would be disingenuous to suppress. 6 Marines, the flower of our battalion, were hanged by the public executioner on the sentence of a criminal court, composed entirely of their own officers, for having at various times robbed the public stores of flour, meat, spirits, tobacco, and many other articles. That was the first 3 chapters of the book called A Complete Account of the Settlement at Port Jackson by Watkin Tench. Please join me next time when I read through chapters 4 to 16. Until next time, I wish you well.